They laughed at the blind cowboy until he rode into the fire to save their children. Nobody saw it coming. The whole town of Copper Ridge was watching, holding their breath, as flames danced higher and higher around the old schoolhouse. Children's screams echoed through the smoky air. The fire was spreading fast, too fast for anyone to reach them. And then, through the chaos and the panic, came the sound of hoofbeats. But these weren't the hoofbeats of the sheriff or the town's bravest men. No, these belonged to Jake Morrison, the cowboy everyone whispered about, the one they called worthless behind his back, the blind man who couldn't even see his own horse, let alone navigate through a wall of flames. The year was 1887. And Copper Ridge was like any other dusty frontier town nestled between the rolling hills of Montana Territory. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling under the relentless prairie sun. The smell of horses, leather, and wood smoke hung permanently in the air. It was a place where a man was judged by his ability to work, to fight, and to provide. And by those standards, Jake Morrison was nothing but a burden. He'd been blind since birth, his eyes a pale gray that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Most folks figured he'd been dealt a cruel hand by fate, doomed to spend his days sitting on porches, dependent on the charity of others. When he first rode into town 3 months ago, leading his chocolate-brown mare by the reins, the townspeople shook their heads in pity and annoyance. "What's a blind man think he's gonna do out here?" Old Pete Hartwell had muttered from his spot outside the general store. "This ain't no place for charity cases." The other men had chuckled agreement. In a town where survival depended on sharp eyes and quick reflexes, what use was a man who couldn't see a rattlesnake until it bit him? But Jake Morrison didn't ask for charity. He found himself a small cabin on the outskirts of town, near where the creek bent around a grove of cottonwood trees. He kept to himself, mostly, though folks would sometimes see him walking the paths around town, his hand trailing along fence posts, his feet knowing exactly where to step. His horse, a mare he called Stella, followed him everywhere like a loyal dog. "That horse is more than he deserves," Sarah Jenkins, the teacher, had said one afternoon as she watched Jake carefully brush Stella's coat behind his cabin. "Beautiful animal like that, wasted on someone who can't even appreciate her properly." The townspeople didn't understand what they were seeing. They watched Jake move around his property with surprising confidence, chopping wood, mending fences, tending to Stella with gentle hands. But they only saw what they expected to see: a helpless man fumbling through life, getting by on luck and the patience of his horse. What they didn't know was that Jake Morrison had been born on a ranch in Colorado, raised by a father who refused to let blindness become an excuse. From the time he could walk, Jake had been taught to listen, to feel, to understand the world through senses most people ignored. His father had placed him on horseback when he was 4 years old, teaching him to communicate with animals through touch, voice, and instinct. "Boy," his father had said, "God took your sight, but he gave you everything else twice as strong. You just gotta learn to use it." And Jake had learned. He learned to read the wind for weather changes, to feel a horse's mood through the saddle, to navigate by the sound of his own voice echoing off buildings and trees. By the time he was 20, he could ride as well as any cowboy in Colorado, could track cattle by sound and smell, could sense danger in the nervous flutter of birds or the sudden stillness of small animals. But his father had died when Jake was 25, and the ranch had been sold to pay debts. Jake had spent the next 10 years drifting from town to town, finding work where he could, facing the same skepticism and pity everywhere he went. Most places he lasted a few weeks before moving on, tired of being treated like a curiosity or a burden. Copper Ridge had been different, though, not because the people were any kinder, but because Jake had finally stopped caring what they thought. He was 35 now, weathered by years of proving himself over and over again. He'd found peace in his little cabin by the creek, with Stella for company, and the familiar sounds of a frontier town settling into its daily rhythms. The morning the fire started had been like any other autumn day. Jake woke before dawn, as he always did, to the sound of Stella nickering softly in her small corral. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the distant smoke from morning cooking fires. He dressed quickly in his worn jeans and flannel shirt, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The town was just beginning to stir. Jake could hear the blacksmith starting his forge, the soft lowing of cattle in the stockyards, the creak of wagon wheels on the main street. He fed Stella her morning oats, running his hands over her neck and flanks, checking for any cuts or swelling. The horse was his lifeline, his eyes and ears when he needed them most. "Another beautiful morning, girl," he murmured, though he couldn't see the golden sunrise painting the hills. He could feel it, though, in the way the air warmed against his face. In the changing sounds as the town came alive, Jake was mending a section of fence when he first smelled it. Not the familiar wood smoke of cooking fires or the blacksmith's forge, but something else, something wrong. The acrid smell of burning timber, too much of it, and carried on a wind that was picking up speed. Stella caught it too. The mare's head came up sharply, her nostrils flaring. Jake dropped his tools and put his hand on her neck, feeling the tension in her muscles. "Easy, girl. What is it?" Then he heard the bell. The fire bell at the center of town, clanging with the desperate rhythm that meant real danger. Jake's blood went cold. He'd heard that bell ring for practice drills, but this wasn't practice. The frantic, irregular pealing spoke of panic and fear. Without hesitation, Jake swung himself up onto Stella's back. He didn't need a saddle for short rides. His balance was perfect, developed over decades of riding. With a gentle pressure of his knees, he guided the mare toward town, following the familiar path by the sound of the creek to his left and the increasing noise ahead. As they got closer, Jake could hear shouting, the stamp of many feet, the crash of falling timber. The smell of smoke was getting stronger, and underneath it, something that made his heart race, the high, terrified screaming of children. They reached the edge of town just as Jake heard Tom Bradley, the mayor, shouting orders. "Form a bucket line. Get every bucket, every pot, anything that'll hold water. Move, people. Where's the fire?" Jake called out, sliding down from Stella's back. "The schoolhouse," someone yelled back. "Whole damn building's going up. Miss Jenkins got most of the kids out, but there's still some trapped inside." Jake's world went silent, except for the roar of flames and those terrible screams. The schoolhouse was at the far end of town, a 2-story wooden building that housed 30 children during school hours. If kids were trapped inside, ... double quotes. How many? Jake shouted. Don't know. Tom Bradley's voice was tight with panic. Maybe 3. Maybe 4. The stairs collapsed, and there's no way up to the second floor. Jake was already moving, leading Stella through the crowd that was forming the bucket line. People parted around him without really noticing who he was, too focused on the crisis to pay attention to the blind cowboy and his horse. But as Jake got closer to the fire, he began to hear the murmurs. What's he doing here? Someone should get him out of the way before he gets hurt. Blind man's got no business near a fire. Jake ignored them. He could feel the heat of the flames now, could hear the hungry crackle of wood being consumed. The screams from inside the building were getting weaker, and that terrified him more than the fire itself. Jake Morrison, you get back from there. That was Dr. Palmer, the town physician. This is no place for you. Jake turned toward the voice, his unseeing eyes finding the doctor's general direction. How many men have tried to get inside? 3. Of our best, but the smoke's too thick, and the heat. Dr. Palmer's voice trailed off. The whole first floor is an inferno. There's no way through. What about the back of the building? Same story. Fire started in the storage room and spread everywhere. Those children. The doctor's voice broke. Jake closed his eyes, though it made no difference to what he could see. He tilted his head, listening past the crowd noise, past the roar of flames. They're faint but unmistakable, the sound of children crying, calling for help. They were still alive, but not for long. The second floor, Jake said quietly. The children are in the second floor classroom. Yes, but Jake, the stairs are gone. Even if a man could get through the fire, there's no way up. Jake's mind was racing. He knew that building. He'd walked past it dozens of times, had traced its dimensions with his ears and his memory. 2 stories, wooden construction, with large windows on the second floor. The windows faced west, toward the setting sun, which meant Stella, Jake said softly, and the mare stepped closer to him. He swung up onto her back in one fluid motion. Jake, no. Dr. Palmer grabbed for his leg, but Jake was already moving. He's lost his mind, someone shouted. Stop him. But Jake wasn't. Heading for the front of the building, where the crowd was fighting the fire. Instead, he guided Stella in a wide circle, using his mental map of the town to navigate around the chaos. The horse trusted him completely, responding to the slightest pressure from his legs, the softest touch of the reins. They rode behind the mercantile, past the empty lot where the children played, toward the backside of the schoolhouse. Here, away from the crowd, Jake could hear more clearly. The fire was loudest at the front and center of the building, but the back wall wasn't fully engulfed yet. The wind was pushing the flames away from the rear windows. Jake pulled Stella to a stop and slid down, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth. He could feel the heat washing over him in waves, could hear the deadly whisper of flames eating through wood and plaster. But he could also hear something else, children's voices, weak but alive, coming from the second-story window directly above him. The window was at least 12 feet off the ground. Under normal circumstances, even a tall man would have trouble reaching it. But Jake Morrison wasn't thinking about normal circumstances. Easy, girl, he whispered to Stella, running his hands along her sides. I know this is scary, but I need you to trust me. Those children need us. The mare's ears flicked forward, and she nuzzled his shoulder gently. She could smell the smoke, could feel the heat, but she'd follow Jake anywhere. That was the bond they'd built over years of depending on each other. Jake led Stella directly under the window, positioning her carefully. Then, with movements born of countless hours of practice, he climbed onto her back and slowly stood up. Balancing on Stella's broad back, his hands found the rough wooden sill of the window. "Hello," he called up. "Can anyone hear me? Help us." The voice was thin and frightened, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. "Please, help us. We can't get out." "I'm here to help," Jake called back, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos around him. "How many of you are there? 4. There's 4 of us. Tommy and me and the Miller twins." Jake's heart clenched. For children trapped with no way down and a fire that was getting closer every minute. The building groaned ominously as support beams weakened and shifted. "Listen to me," Jake called up. "I'm going to get you out, but I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I want you to look around the room. Is there anything you can use to break the window? A chair, a poker from the fireplace, anything heavy?" There was a moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps and hushed conversation. "There's a chair," the girl called down. "A big wooden chair. Perfect. Now, I want you to cover your faces with anything you can find. Your shirts, a blanket, anything. Then break out that window. Don't worry about cutting yourself a little. We need to get you out of there right now." Jake heard the crash of breaking glass, felt the tiny shards raining down around him. The opening was clear now, but it was still 12 feet down to where he stood on Stella's back. "Okay," Jake called up, "here's what we're going to do. I want the smallest child to come to the window first. I'm going to catch you, but you have to trust me. I'm going to be right here." "But mister," the girl's voice was shaking now, "you can't see us. How are you going to catch us?" For a moment, Jake felt the familiar sting of being reduced to his blindness. But then he pushed the feeling aside. These children needed him too. Be more than his limitations. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I might not be able to see you, but I can hear exactly where you are. I know when you're scared and when you're brave, and I promise you, I will catch you. But we have to hurry." Behind them, Jake could hear the crowd finally realizing what was happening. Voices were raised in alarm and disbelief. "Morrison's behind the building. He's trying to get the kids out. Someone stop him before he gets them all killed." But Jake blocked out the noise. His entire world had narrowed to the window above, the frightened children, and Stella's steady presence beneath him. "I'm coming down." The girl's voice was closer now. Jake could hear her at the edge of the window. "Wait," Jake said quickly. "Tell me your name first." "Lucy. Lucy Patterson." "Well, Lucy Patterson, I'm Jake Morrison, and my horse here is Stella. We're going to get you home safe, I promise. Now, when you jump, I want you to aim for my voice. Don't look down, just listen to me and jump toward my voice." Jake spread his arms wide, his body balanced perfectly on Stella's back. The mare stood like a statue, understanding somehow that this was the most important thing she'd ever been asked to do. "I'm scared," Lucy whispered. "I know you are," Jake said softly. "But Lucy, I've been catching things I can't see my whole life. Apples falling from trees, tools that slip from my hands, even baby birds that fall from their nests. You're not going to fall, I promise." There was a long moment of silence. Then Jake heard the rustle of fabric, the scrape of small boots against the window frame. I'm jumping. Jake tracked the sound, his arms moving automatically to where his ears told him she would be. He felt the small body hit his chest, his arms closing around her, protectively. Lucy Patterson was safe. I got you, he murmured, climbing down from Stella's back with the girl in his arms. You're safe now. Lucy was crying, but she was alive and unharmed. Jake set her gently on the ground just as Dr. Palmer came running around the corner of the building. Good Lord, the doctor breathed. Jake, how did you take her? Jake said, already climbing back onto Stella. There's 3 more up there. The next child was Tommy Briggs, a 10-year-old boy who tried to be brave but couldn't stop. His voice from shaking as he called down. Jake caught him just as easily as he had Lucy, his arms sure and strong. Then came the Miller twins, 8-year-old identical boys who went everywhere together. The first twin jumped without hesitation, trusting in Jake's promise, but his brother hesitated at the window, paralyzed by fear as smoke began to pour more heavily from the room behind him. I can't, the boy cried. I can't do it. The building groaned again, and Jake could hear the fire getting closer to the 2nd floor. They were running out of time. Hey, Jake called up, his voice cutting through the boy's panic. What's your name? Michael. Michael Miller. Michael, do you know what the most important thing is when you're scared? No, sir. The most important thing is to trust the people who care about you. Your brother trusted me. Lucy trusted me. Tommy trusted me. And they're all safe down here. I care about you, Michael, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Jake's voice was steady, confident, filled with the kind of certainty that could only come from years of facing fears in darkness. But what if you miss, Michael? Jake said, and now his voice carried something deeper, something that made even the adults gathering behind him stop and listen. I've never missed catching something important in my entire life. Not once. And I'm not going to start with you. The boy appeared at the window, his small silhouette dark against the orange glow of the fire behind him. Jump toward my voice. Son, I'm right here. Michael Miller jumped, and Jake caught him, just like the others, safe, alive, whole, as Jake climbed down from Stella's back for the last time. The rear wall of the schoolhouse finally succumbed to the flames. The window where the children had been trapped was now a rectangle of fire, orange and hungry and deadly. If they had waited even 5 more minutes, the crowd that had gathered was silent now, staring at Jake Morrison with something they'd never felt before, respect. These were the same people who had whispered about him, who had dismissed him as useless, who had wondered what a blind man thought he was doing in their town. Dr. Palmer was checking over the children, his hands shaking as he confirmed that all 4 were unharmed. Sarah Jenkins, the school teacher, was crying openly as she hugged each child who had been in her classroom when the fire started. Jake, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. Jake was brushing soot from Stella's mane, checking her for any injuries from their proximity to the fire. The mayor was calm now, as if she understood that their work was done. No need to thank me, Miss Jenkins. Just glad we could help. Tom Bradley, the mayor, stepped forward. He was a big man, used to being the most important person in any room, but now he seemed small and uncertain. Morrison, he said slowly, I owe you an apology. We all do. Jake turned toward the mayor's voice, his expression neutral. "No apology needed, Mr. Bradley. Just doing what anyone would do." "But that's just it," Bradley said, his voice getting stronger. "Anyone else would have run toward the front of the building, would have tried to fight through the flames like the others did. You ... You saw something the rest of us missed. You found a way when there wasn't supposed to be a way." Old Pete Hartwell, who had been the loudest in his criticism of Jake when he first arrived, pushed through the crowd. His weathered face was streaked with tears. "Son," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I said some things, I thought some things, that I ain't proud of. You just saved my grandson. Tommy's my daughter's boy, and if you hadn't..." Pete couldn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. He reached out and found the old man's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Your grandson's a brave boy, Mr. Hartwell. You should be proud of him." As the fire continued to burn through the schoolhouse, reducing it to ash and memory, the townspeople of Copper Ridge began to see Jake Morrison differently. They watched him move with Stella, saw the perfect communication between man and horse, witnessed the quiet confidence that came from years of navigating the world without sight. Sarah Jenkins approached him as the crowd began to disperse. "Jake," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something. How did you know to go to the back of the building? How did you know exactly where that window was?" Jake smiled, the first real smile anyone in Copper Ridge had seen from him. "Miss Jenkins, when you can't see, you learn to notice things that other folks miss. I've walked past that schoolhouse probably 100 times since I've been here. Every time I could hear the children's voices coming from that second-floor window. I knew exactly where it was because I've been listening to it all along." He paused, stroking Stella's neck. "And I knew the wind patterns around this building. I could tell that the fire was being pushed away from the back wall. It was the only chance those children had." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "You saw things we couldn't see, even though you can't see at all." "Sometimes," Jake said thoughtfully, "not seeing with your eyes means you see with everything else, your ears, your nose, your heart. Most folks rely so much on their eyes that they forget they have other ways of understanding the world." As the weeks passed after the fire, everything changed for Jake Morrison in Copper Ridge. The townspeople who had once dismissed him now sought him out for advice. When cattle went missing, they asked Jake to help track them. His ability to follow sounds and read signs in the dirt was better than anyone else's. When storms threatened, they listened to his weather predictions, learned from his ability to read the wind and the behavior of animals. The mayor offered him a job as deputy sheriff, but Jake declined with a smile. He preferred his quiet life by the creek, though he was always willing to help when needed. Sarah Jenkins visited his cabin one evening in late October, carrying a basket of fresh bread and a thermos of coffee. They sat on his porch as the sun set, listening to the creek babble and the evening birds call to each other. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, "about what you said that day, about seeing with everything else. Oh, I've been trying it in my classroom, really listening to my students, paying attention to things I used to miss. You'd be amazed what you can learn about a child when you stop just looking and start really noticing." Jake nodded. "People are like horses in some ways. They tell you everything you need to know if you just pay attention to the right things." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Well," Sarah watched, Jake felt them, sensed them in the cooling air and the changing sounds of the evening. "Jake," Sarah said eventually, "would you consider doing something for me?" "Depends what it is. The children have been asking about you. They want to hear stories about how you learned to do what you do. Would you? Would you come to the school sometime and talk to them?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. The idea of being the center of attention, of having children stare at him with curiosity, should have made him uncomfortable. But instead, he found himself thinking about Lucy Patterson's voice as she jumped toward him, about the trust in her small hands as he caught her. "I reckon I could do that," he said finally. "Might be good for them to learn that there's more than one way to see the world." The new schoolhouse was built that winter, with donations from every family in Copper Ridge, and several from neighboring towns who had heard the story of the blind cowboy and the fire. It was larger than the old one, with wider windows and better ventilation, but most importantly, it had something the old schoolhouse had never had: a picture on the wall. It wasn't much of a picture, really. Tommy Briggs had drawn it with charcoal on a piece of birch bark, a simple sketch of a man on horseback reaching up toward a window. At the bottom, in carefully printed letters, it said, "Jake Morrison, hero." When Jake first came to speak to the children in their new classroom, Sarah told him about the picture. She described it in detail, from Stella's carefully drawn mane to the determined expression on Jake's face. The children insisted on hanging it right where everyone could see it, she said. They wanted to make sure nobody ever forgets what happened that day. Jake ran his fingers over the rough bark, feeling the raised lines of charcoal that captured a moment when everything changed, not just for the children he'd saved, but for himself and for an entire town that had learned to see beyond the surface. "Miss Jenkins," he said quietly, "would you mind reading me what it says at the bottom?" Sarah's voice was soft as she read, "Jake Morrison, hero." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still tracing the simple drawing. "You know what's funny about that word?" he said finally. "What's that?" "I never set out to be a hero that day. I just heard children who needed help, and I knew I had the skills to help them. Sometimes being a hero isn't about being the strongest, or the fastest, or the bravest. Sometimes it's just about using whatever gifts you have, even when other people don't understand what those gifts are." The children listened with wide eyes as Jake told them about learning to ride, about the years of building trust with horses, about the way sound could paint pictures that were just as clear as anything you could see with your eyes. "Mr. Morrison," Lucy Patterson raised her hand, "were you scared when you rode Stella to save us?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I was scared for you," he said honestly, "but I wasn't scared of what I was doing. When you've spent your whole life learning to navigate without sight, riding toward the sound of someone who needs help feels as natural as breathing." "But what if you had fallen?" Tommy Briggs asked. "Well," Jake said with a slight smile, "I reckon that would have been a problem. But you know what? Stella wouldn't have let me fall. That's what happens when you really trust someone. They don't let you fall, and you don't let them fall either." Michael Miller, the twin who had been most frightened to jump, raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. Morrison, my PA says you used to live somewhere else before you came here. Why did you come to Copper Ridge?" Jake leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the new building's walls. It was a fair question, and these children deserved an honest answer. Michael, I've lived in a lot of places over the years, and in most of those places, people looked at me and saw only what I couldn't do. They saw the blindness before they saw the man. I came to Copper Ridge because, well, because sometimes you have to go somewhere new to become who you're really meant to be. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I thought I was coming here to live quietly, to stop trying to prove myself to people who would never understand. But maybe I was really coming here because 4 children were going to need help one day, and I was the only one who could give it to them. The children were quiet, processing this idea. Finally, Lucy spoke up again. Mr. Morrison, are you going to stay in Copper Ridge now? Jake smiled, the question touching something deep in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Not because people pitied him or tolerated him, but because they valued him for who he really was. Yes, Lucy, I think I am going to stay. As winter settled over Copper Ridge, Jake Morrison became as much a part of the town as the creek that ran behind his cabin or the mountains that rose up around them. Children would wave to him as he rode Stella through town, their young voices calling out cheerful greetings. Adults nodded respectfully, no longer seeing him as an outsider or a burden. The fire had burned more than just a building that day. It had burned away assumptions and prejudices, fears and misunderstandings. In their place, it had left something stronger, a community that had learned to see with more than just their eyes. Dr. Palmer started consulting with Jake about patients who seemed physically healthy but troubled in ways the doctor couldn't diagnose. Jake's ability to read people's voices, to hear the things they weren't saying, proved invaluable in understanding. When someone was struggling with grief, fear, or despair, the blacksmith, a man named Carl Brennan, discovered that Jake could identify problems with horses, gaits, and breathing that even experienced horsemen missed. Soon, people were bringing their animals to Jake for a kind of diagnosis that went beyond the physical. He hears things, Carl told his wife one evening after Jake had correctly identified a developing problem with their prize stallion's left front hoof. It's like he can hear into the future somehow, catch problems before they become disasters. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the children of Copper Ridge saw the world. Having been saved by someone who navigated life differently than they did, they became more observant, more thoughtful about the ways people could be strong and capable. Lucy Patterson began closing her eyes when she walked familiar paths, learning to trust her other senses. Tommy Briggs started paying attention to the sounds animals made, discovering he could predict weather changes by listening to the way birds called to each other. The Miller twins developed an almost supernatural ability to work together, finishing each other's thoughts and moving in perfect coordination. It's like Jake taught them that there are different ways to be powerful. Sarah Jenkins told Dr. Palmer one afternoon as they watched the children playing in the schoolyard. They're not just using their eyes anymore, they're using everything. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a warmth that melted the last of the winter snow and filled the creek behind Jake's cabin with rushing water. Jake was repairing his fence again, the same section that had been damaged in a late winter storm, when he heard horses approaching. There were 3 riders, moving at a steady pace but not hurrying. Jake listened to the rhythm of their horses' hooves, the creak of leather, the low murmur of conversation. Strangers, but not threatening ones. Stella lifted her head from grazing, her ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. Jake trusted the mare's instincts completely if she wasn't worried. Neither was he. The riders stopped at his gate, and Jake heard the sound of men dismounting. "Excuse me," one of them called out. "Are you Jake Morrison?" "I am," Jake replied, setting down his hammer and walking toward the voices. "What can I do for you, gentlemen? My name's Robert Patterson. I'm Lucy's father." Jake's expression softened immediately. Lucy's father. He'd heard about the man from Sarah Jenkins. Robert Patterson owned a large ranch about 50 miles south of Copper Ridge, too far away for Lucy to live at home during the school year. She boarded with the Jenkins family during the week and went home to her father's ranch on weekends. "Mr. Patterson," Jake said, extending his hand. "Your daughter's a remarkable young lady, brave as they come." Robert Patterson took Jake's hand. In both of his grip firm and warm. "Mr. Morrison, Lucy has told me what you did for her, what you did for all those children. I can never repay you for that." "No repayment necessary," Jake said simply. "I'm just glad I was there when she needed help." "Well, that's actually why I'm here." Patterson's voice carried a note of excitement. "Mr. Morrison, I run one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, and I'm getting older. My eyes aren't what they used to be. I need someone I can trust, someone who can read the land and the animals the way you do." Jake felt a flutter of surprise. "Mr. Patterson, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure what you're asking." "I'm asking you to come work for me as my ranch foreman. Full salary, your own house on the property, whatever you need for your horse. I've heard from people in town about your abilities, about how you can track lost cattle, predict weather, understand animals in ways most men can't." The other two men introduced themselves as neighboring ranchers who had heard similar stories. Word of Jake Morrison's unusual skills had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who had witnessed or heard about the schoolhouse fire. "We're not offering you charity," one of them said firmly. "We're offering you work that you're better qualified for than any man in Montana territory. The question is whether you're interested." Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to Stella move through the grass behind him, to the creek flowing past his cabin, to the familiar sounds of Copper Ridge in the distance. This place had become home in a way nowhere else ever had. These people had learned to see him for who he really was, but he was also thinking about Lucy Patterson's voice as she jumped toward him, about the trust those children had placed in him. Maybe there were other places where people needed to learn that strength came in many different forms. "Mr. Patterson," Jake said finally, "I'm honored by your offer, but I'm going to have to decline." The ranchers exchanged glances, clearly disappointed. "However," Jake continued, "I'd be willing to come work for you part of the year, say during cattle drives and roundups, when you need the extra help most. The rest of the time, I'd like to stay here in Copper Ridge." Robert Patterson's face lit up. That would be perfect, actually. The seasonal work is when we need the most skilled help. And so began a new chapter in Jake Morrison's life. During the busy seasons, he would travel with Stella to the Patterson Ranch and others throughout the territory, earning a reputation as the best tracker and animal handler in Montana. But he always returned to Copper Ridge, to his cabin by the creek, and the community that had learned to value him for exactly who he was. Years passed, And the story of the blind cowboy who rode into the fire became legend throughout the territory. But in Copper Ridge, Jake Morrison was just Jake, a neighbor who would help you find lost cattle, a friend who could predict the weather better than anyone, a man who had taught an entire town that seeing wasn't always about eyes. Lucy Patterson grew up to become a teacher herself, traveling to small frontier schools throughout the West. Wherever she went, she told the story of the man who had saved her life, and more importantly, the lesson he had taught her about the different ways people could be strong and capable. Tommy Briggs became a veteran,